This is Yes Presents Rising Up with Sonali, and I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, Senior Editor at Yes Media. You can find this program at yesmagazine.org, watch it on Free Speech TV, and listen to it on community and independent radio stations nationwide. After weeks of internal and external pressure, President Joe Biden dropped out of the 2024 presidential race last weekend and endorsed his Vice President Kamala Harris for the Democratic Party nomination. Harris quickly received enough delegate pledges to become the likely nominee at the Democratic National Convention in August. Her campaign announced it raised a record-breaking $100 million in donations in just days. In 2020, she became the first woman and the first woman of color to ever be vice president. If elected this November, her presidency would be equally groundbreaking on the issue of demographic representation. My guest is Aimee Allison, founder and president of She the People. Welcome to the program, Aimee.
I'm so happy to be here.
And in a former life, you and I were colleagues at Pacifica Radio. We're now at this very interesting time in our sort of political landscape where we see a woman of color closer to the presidency than ever before. Although Kamala Harris ran for the nomination 4 years ago, of course, in the end, it was Joe Biden who was crowned. We've had women come close to the presidency, such as Hillary Clinton, who became the Democratic nominee in 2016. But for Kamala Harris to be the presumptive nominee, this is as close as it's ever gotten, right? Aimee, are you thinking of Shirley Chisholm? Are you thinking of the elders of the movement who laid the groundwork for someone like Kamala to come along?
I always think Kamala is the archetype, but there are so many prototypes. I'm thinking of the Black and brown women who worked hard to find a place in democracy. I mean, women of color have largely had access to the ballot box really for just over 50 years. And look at how far we've come. Black women, as a subgroup of women of color, are key drivers and who are reaching a level of influence and power that even when I started She the People in 2018, before that midterm election, I couldn't have predicted. The rise in power in terms of visibility, appointments to the Supreme Court, roles behind the scenes. For example, the person who is in charge of the convention, a Black woman, the people who are key in terms of driving media coverage, Black women. And so we're seeing in this country the evolution of decades of work. And for someone like me, who's Gen X, who's been at this for 30 years, I have such tremendous gratitude for the generations of women who worked and labored, largely unseen and mostly unappreciated, to build the building blocks of what has now become the Kamala Harris presidency. And it's never, ever been about one person. Democracy cannot be about one person. But there's nothing like a presidential campaign to open the space for women of color, for our issues, for us as organizers, us as voters. And so this moment, I'm both incredibly appreciative of, and I know how tough the road ahead is going to be.
Let's talk about issues. It's one thing to have somebody like Kamala Harris as the Democratic nominee, and it would have been a different thing altogether had, say, the Republican Party picked a woman of color. Issues and the intersection of the demographics that Kamala Harris represents, I think, are going to be key in terms of discussion here. Women of color are the least represented in our governments, right? And yet have the worst statistical disadvantage when it comes to social indicators, indicators around health and mortality and employment and wages. And so that need to have that greater representation is most stark where women of color, Black and brown women in particular, are, right? And those issues of equality, of the economy, the bread and butter issues, are those what you are thinking about right now?
I'm thinking about all of it. I'm thinking of foreign policy, war and peace, I'm thinking about the cost of living. I'm thinking about the ways in which government can alleviate suffering and spend our resources. Whose priority? I'm thinking of the possibilities there. And electing Kamala Harris as president is another tremendous step in recentering the center of gravity, the priorities, and the focus of US politics, not only here domestically, but abroad.
You mentioned foreign policy, which has been a huge issue this past year. Now, Joe Biden on domestic policies has moved to the left. He moved to the left of Barack Obama. I mean, it's not as though necessarily he gets the credit for that, or even necessarily Bernie Sanders, whose candidacy sort of pushed him, but really there's been a grassroots movement, right, of people on the left demanding Biden do, or whoever was president, do something about economic issues, about unions, about all of the things that Biden did improve on his predecessors. But when it came to the issue of foreign policy, in particular Gaza, it's been very disappointing. And a lot of young folks, a lot of Gen Z folks, really saying that they were going to sit out this election when they thought Biden was the nominee because they just couldn't back a person who has enabled genocide. Kamala Harris is part of the Biden administration. How does one approach that?
Well, I think of it this way. Presidential candidate Kamala Harris is the only person that can offer the continuity of successful domestic policies, certainly the direction that the administration had been pointing, and a fresh start when it comes to policies like the U.S. Unbridled support of Israel's actions in Gaza. And I think there's an understanding that the coalition, of whom women of color across the country, as well as young people, as you've mentioned, were very upset. The coalition that elected Biden-Harris in 2020 broke down a lot over this issue. And we've got an opportunity for a fresh start. We already see this week Netanyahu being invited. Kamala Harris will not be there, will not meet with him. And that's a good indicator of the space between the policies that Biden had pursued, the visual and kind of unadulterated support that Biden had shown, and what could be the foreign policy of a Harris administration.